Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Oxford Economics' most recent North American Cities Outlook webinar today. My name is George Armitage. I'm head of Global Real Estate, and today we want to go into a bit more detail in trying to understand the prospects for cities and metros in both the US and Canada. We're certainly at an interesting stage for the region as a whole, both with a stronger outlook for the US economy as a whole, but also obviously the impact of lower oil prices and what that may do. I think to understand what these impacts will be, I think we need to look at where we come from, particularly down to the metro level, and then we maybe have a better idea about where we're going to be heading for these metros across the region. Just a bit of housekeeping, if you could possibly keep your phones on mute to avoid any disturbance, and we will be taking some questions at the end. We expect the webinar to be between 30 and 35 minutes with some time for some questions at the end. So if you could go to the top right-hand side of the screen and go to the chat box and input any questions you may have during the webinar, we will do our best to answer them all towards the end. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Aidan Carter. Aidan is a senior economist and he's with our Global Cities Forecasting team, and Aidan is going to be talking about the North American regions now. Aidan, off to you.
Hi everyone. Just echoing George's sentiments, let me thank you for tuning in today. As George says, my name is Aidan McCarter and I'm responsible for running the North American Cities and Regions Forecasting Service for Oxford Economics. Essentially, what this presentation will focus on is the subnational economic landscape, and particularly important, the forecast outlook, both within the United States and Canada. For both countries, the macroeconomic landscape and fundamentals driving the economy are, for the most part, fairly strong, certainly when you place it in the context of other global leading economies. However, at a subnational level, there's a large degree of divergence in the historical and forecast future performance, and it's these disparities and the reasons for them that will form the basis of today's presentation. So I've already discussed the key overall objective for today's webinar. It's probably useful to quickly outline an agenda as to what you can expect to hear over the next 30 minutes or so. The presentation will focus mainly on the US, with Canada covered a little bit more succinctly at the end. The structure will be to firstly provide some US national macroeconomic context, and then analyse the national industry picture again for the US. I'll then move on to looking at the metros, firstly recent trends, and then a more in-depth look at the forecast period for the metros. So finally, as mentioned, I'll finish up the main part of the presentation with a focus on Canada and open up the floor to any questions that you might have. So subnationally for the US, Oxford Economics provide a full range of data and forecasts for both states and Metropolitan Statistical Areas, or metros as I'll be referring to them as throughout this presentation. It's important to note our metro boundaries are the most current, as released in February 2013 by the Office of Management and Budget, while for Canada we cover both provinces and metro areas. However, for this presentation, I think I'm going to narrow the scope down slightly, cover the largest 30 US metros and 6 Canadian metros in certain cases. So effectively, the geography is denoted on the slide here in the map. To help present a picture of how economic growth may be clustered into certain regions, I'm going to use color coding. I split the US up into 5 regions which were designated internally. So that's the East in blue, the South in green, the Midwest in red, Southwest and Mountains in black, and Pacific in purple. The Canadian metros will then be covered in gold. When Oxford Economics coverage spans a range of demographic, labour market, economic variables, so everything from house prices to GDP, to employment to retail sales. It's primarily GDP that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, both in terms of total growth and the sector composition and sector contribution. So worth just briefly touching the macroeconomic overview for the US, given that the metro performance is intrinsically linked to and shaped by the national picture. On the whole, the US is on a sound economic footing. Economic fundamentals are the strongest in a decade, and that means growth of 2.4% in 2014. We forecast could be dwarfed with the 2015 forecast of 3.3%, and that will remain largely strong thereafter, 2.8% growth over the short to medium term, which we define as 2015 to 2019. So while internally things remain fairly positive, there are of course downside risks as presented on the slide here. The main one emanating from the turbulent international environment. China's double-digit growth previously has been revised down by Oxford Economics to about 6 to 7% over the forecast period, and obviously ongoing Eurozone pressures persist. Closer to home, strong dollars may well impact on trade competitiveness. There's a clear laggard in recovery in the form of the housing sector. Activity remains sluggish in terms of a few metrics like permits granted, while the index levels from the FHFA have not recovered the levels pre-downturn. Obstacles remain, particularly for young people, though as I'll come on to in a minute, the tide does seem to be turning. However, the good news does seem to outweigh the bad. Oil price falls in 2014 and early 2015 are probably more likely to affect economies other than the US, given its strong fundamentals to fall back on, and given that oil exposure as a percentage of total GDP and business investment is relatively small in the US. In terms of the labour market, the recent data suggests fewer layoffs, unemployment rate is fairly low, and labour market dynamics are looking better. Leading on from the fall in gas prices, consumer confidence has actually strengthened. We would suggest that there might be up to a $1,400 saving per household in 2015. And what that means is that money can effectively be spent in other sectors of the economy. Wages growth, again, remains strong, and that will trigger consumer spending growth of over 3% this year. There's going to be an excess or pent-up demand for housing if the constraints like permits are lifted. Like I say, we as a company believe that the tide is turning for real estate, driven by a rebound in household formation and ownership among America's youth in particular. This should be aided by supportive home loan rates and increased affordability, and of course intrinsically linked is the modest interest rates. Earlier this week, the Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen struck a decidedly dovish tone in indicating that it would be a while before the Open Market Committee makes a move in interest rates. And this commitment to a patient stance is what we had expected, what we have set up to now, and it's likely to be probably September at least before any hike comes to pass. So again, reiterating the GDP growth outturns, an acceleration this year to 3.3% and over the long term averaging out at about 2.8%. If we delve a little bit more into the industry picture for the US, analysing what has happened since 2010 up to 2014, i.e. history, and what is expected to materialise from this year up to 2015 to 2019. Essentially, this slide and the next are two similar ways to present, or two different ways to present a similar story. So we first look at the average annual growth rates over the time periods. The last 4 years have seen growth in all sectors of the economy other than government, and that's the sum of local, state and federal government. That's a clear indication of the austerity measures kicking in over that time. And to that effect, education GDP increases have also been largely muted. As mentioned previously, there is a pent-up demand in the housing market, and that's very starkly evidenced in the top sector for construction. Basically stagnant between 2010 and 2014, but the fastest growing sector, 6.1% annual average growth, we envisage between 2015 and 2019. The sectoral picture over the short-term forecast should see public services continue to struggle, with the greatest recovery in construction, information, manufacturing and retail. And again, the same trends are evident if we look at the industry contributions to GDP growth. Essentially, this chart here puts industry performance into a little bit more context in terms of the scale of the sector, so it removes some of the anomalies in terms of high growth rates in some of the smaller sectors like mining. And here we can see that the sectors that performed well over the last 4 to 5 years, we envisage for the most part should continue to do so. So for example, business services and real estate lead the way in both cases. And that's a key indication of our belief that the recovery will be focused in exportable service sectors. Manufacturing, particularly higher value-added industries, should continue to drive total growth, as should retail, which fits with their story presented previously in terms of increased consumer confidence and subsequently increased consumer spending. Again, fourth down is construction, and that's where the starkest contrast lies. Up until now, performance has been subdued, but we think things should start to gain momentum from this year onwards. So effectively, the metros with the highest proportion in the top bars here, the likes of business, manufacturing, and construction, we believe if they contain these sectors, it should put them at the forefront of being able to enjoy GDP growth over time. I won't go into this chart in too much detail, but it fits very nicely at this point in the presentation because it shows how Oxford Economics global and national macroeconomic and industry forecasts fit with our forecasts at a metro level. So effectively, our forecasts at a metro level are a function of metro historical data, global and national trends, and a set of drivers specific to each sector. So to give a real example, given investment in the US and the strong outlook for information sector at the US level, our method ensures that we capture the positive impact that San Jose's booming IT sector has. In turn, given the level of diversity and openness in the US labour market, that means that people will migrate to where the labour opportunities exist. That means immigration for San Jose to take up those jobs. That in turn means more spending in local sectors like retail and leisure, more pressure on public services to cater for the higher population, and the greater need for supply chain industries and public service jobs to support high growth sectors. Essentially what it's saying is everything in our suite of models is interlinked, so that if a metro is reliant on, say, exports or consumer spending, imports or housing, that's all captured by our forecasts. So let's briefly move on to examine how metros have performed relative to one another over the last few years. In terms of performance against the US as a whole, over half of the 30 metros have actually been outpaced by the national average growth of 2.2% over the course of the last few years. What this suggests is that city economies have found it hard to gather momentum since the downturn. It's obvious from the chart here that there are real disparities in metro performance over time, and that some metros have bounced back quicker than others. So you can see here at the top, San Jose leads the way, average annual growth of 5.9%, and that's a clear indication that its sectoral structure, the specialisms in IT, the manufacturing industries catering for the IT sector, as well as professional services, was ideally suited for economic growth in the metro. You can see that San Jose, the top performers, relative performance is 8 times quicker than the worst performer, which is Las Vegas. Again, no real surprises here, fairly intuitive. Las Vegas obviously relies heavily on housing and construction, but also consumer spending to drive its retail, hospitality, and leisure businesses. You can see there was a certain degree of geographical correlation between performance. So you can see in purple, Pacific had the top 2 performers in San Jose and Portland, and 3 of the top 6 when joined by Seattle. By comparison, all of the southern metros in green, other than Charlotte, have underperformed, and that again might be related to the construction and housing crash and a greater impact there. And a final observation, New York, somewhat of a signature metro, has actually underperformed over history. Growth averaged about 1.8%, so a little way below the US national average. So that sort of presents the pattern of disparity across history. Do we think that those disparities will exist in the future? Will industry linkages be a driver behind growth? Let's move on and find out. Firstly, compared to a couple of slides ago where we showed that metros in the whole lagged the pace of US growth, we can see now that actually metros over the forecast period we expect to largely outperform the US average over the short to medium term. So actually 23 out of the 30 metros rank above the US national average, so an additional 9 from before. And that's a clear indication that cities are well placed to regain their strength over the forecast period. And that actually comes despite the US average growth rate accelerating up to 2.8%. It's just that metros are performing considerably stronger still. Comparing the metros themselves, the historical disparities do indeed persist, albeit the fastest metro, which again is San Jose, actually is probably only about 3 times faster than the worst, which is the much maligned metro of Detroit. The modest geographical pattern of the past becomes, albeit a lot clearer in the future, and this at least partially has to do with passing from a phase which was largely cyclical to one that is much more driven by long-term fundamentals. There are a number of overarching findings in the chart here. Firstly, the metros in the Midwest in red, except for Minneapolis and Paul, we forecast will underperform and run the risk of getting left behind. The southern metros in green face a much more buoyant recovery than they have over the last few years as construction and housing activity picks up. All 5 comfortably outpace the US average. The economies of the Pacific again seem to lead the way, all 7 being above the US, while the eastern metros, partially due to their scale, have a performance that is much more stable and reflective of the US as a whole. So you can see here in the chart that Philadelphia, Washington, and Pittsburgh all cluster around the US average of 2.8%. And again, ending with New York, growth has risen from the historical period, signifying moderately more promising times ahead for the Big Apple. There's undoubtedly a degree of correlation between historical and forecast future performance. So you can see here from this chart that San Jose and Portland remain 1 and 2 in our rankings. However, there have been big jumps in other regions. The biggest ones upwards are likely to be in the southern states like Orlando and Tampa, jumping 18 places as construction begins to recuperate, while the biggest falls might be in the Midwest metros, the likes of Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis, which simply aren't geared for growth, and a clear rebalancing is necessary there. Houston is obviously a pretty interesting one, given its reliance on extraction, more so than any other US metro by some distance. I'll go into Houston a little bit more and some focus later on, but it's worth drawing your attention to it here. You can see it at mid-table. It was 3rd in the rankings, slips to number 16. Interestingly, if we had, when we conducted this webinar 9 months ago, it would have remained in the top 5 or 6. So again, very briefly, let's reiterate that it's probably 5 sectors that are going to, in order, drive and contribute to economic growth, and that's business services, manufacturing, wholesale and retail, construction and information. We believe they could contribute up to about 3/4 of the total growth over the next 5 years. So the metros that contain these sorts of sectors are probably best placed to enjoy such growth. The next few slides are effectively going to try and paint a correlation between the secular composition on the one hand and future economic growth on the other, using scatter plots. So the x-axis in each case represents GDP growth over the forecast period, while the y-axis shows the GDP detention quotient, or LQ. Basically, what an LQ is, it defines a measure by which GDP as a percentage of the total relative to the US as a whole is in any particular sector. So if the GDP LQ is 1, it means that metro has about the same strength in that sector as the US as a whole. If it's greater than 1, it's somewhat strong in that sector, while if it's less than 1, it might be slightly underdeveloped in that sector. So effectively, we're looking at the metros label to see any certain trends, but we're also looking at the line of best fit to see if there is any best fit correlation between the concentration of GDP growth and the likelihood of overall the contribution of the sector and the likelihood of overall GDP growth. So if we firstly look at construction, obviously the story is a little different to other growth sectors in the economy. Construction obviously fell massively in the late 90s, so effectively growth here is a return to where things are. There's a lot more scope for growth in other sectors that were more insulated during the downturn. The largest LQs are for Houston, Riverside, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. So ignoring Houston at the moment, the other 3, if you refer back to the growth rankings table, you can see that they all actually rose in the rankings. We estimate Phoenix will rise, pun intended, to third place, while Las Vegas, previously at the bottom, escapes to a place around mid-table and above the US. Obviously, there are going to be anomalies here in the relationship. Look at San Jose, the lowest GDP location quotient in construction. If we go to the next slide, that's because IT is actually the main contributor of growth to San Jose. It's joined by two other Pacific metros, Los Angeles and Seattle, in terms of having the highest GDP location quotients. By comparison, Houston, one of the largest fallers compared to recent times, appears to be underdeveloped in the sector. Obviously, the growth path for information is a little bit different to construction. IT didn't crash at all. It's a case of a sector being strong in the bad times, strong in the good times, fundamentally, and a very strong sector. However, one of the key parallels to take from this slide and the last is the upward sloping line of best fit, which indicates that there is a positive correlation between having a specialism in information and construction and the likelihood of future GDP growth. For manufacturing, interestingly, albeit probably not surprisingly, San Jose and Portland are number 1 and 2 in the growth rankings, but also have the highest GDP location quotients. However, Detroit actually has the 3rd highest manufacturing location quotient, and yet it's the worst performing US metro. So how can that be the case? Well, effectively the answer lies in delving a little bit deeper into the manufacturing subsector data. So we envisage the rebalancing of the sector will be in higher value added, higher skilled, higher productivity sectors. So San Jose and Portland obviously contain specialisms in companies engaging in high-tech manufacturing of computer components and software for the IT sector, fairly high value added industries. If you compare that to Detroit, the motor city, it obviously faces a massive reliance on automotive manufacturing, where our outlook is entirely less positive. And again, very importantly, the scatter best fit line is upward sloping, showing that the greater concentration of manufacturing, perhaps the more likely GDP growth will emanate. And if we compare this to a sector where the outlook's a little weaker, namely education, the best fit line switches to being a little bit more negative, so that economies like Boston and Pittsburgh, where education is a specialism, are likely to have more subdued growth. Pittsburgh, for example, falls slightly below the US national average over time. Compare that to Las Vegas, which is a key mover up in the rankings. There's a lower proportion of education, and for that point, government and health. So it should be sheltered from the effects of austerity. Now, it's worth clarifying at this stage that having education is not a prerequisite to subdue GDP growth, far from it. If we take the likes of Boston, obviously has specialisms in world-renowned health institutions, Ivy League universities. That's advantageous in attracting firms from perhaps other growth sectors like finance or life sciences to take advantage of the highly skilled workforce and strong quality of life indicators. So the correlation here really pertains to where education, or for that matter health and government, are particularly strong in a metro that doesn't perhaps have as much to fall back on. So if we move on to taking a little bit more focus on a few metros, I've handpicked a few that have contrasting stories, ones that effectively stand out from the crowd. So some have fallen the right and some have prospered, and there's also a nice spread across both the geographical regions and in terms of their sectoral makeup. In each metro slide, the chart in each case reflects the contributions to GDP growth, effectively showing the importance of respective sectors to each metro's future forecast performance. So I suppose as an Irish person presenting in US metros, where better to start from Boston, the home of the new Super Bowl champions. Unfortunately, our forecast indicates that the city's sporting prowess might only temper a more subdued atmosphere in terms of GDP growth. We envisage that it will accelerate from 2.5% from 2010 to 14 to 2.9% during 2015 to 19. So that would mean Boston falling about 7 places in the rankings. And again, Boston obviously associated with world-renowned healthcare institutions, elite universities, which provide a critical mass of highly educated labour. Boston has in the past, and we believe it will continue, use that their comparative advantage to attract some of the other high-growth sectors. Indeed, we can actually see that it's business services and real estate, and to a lesser extent manufacturing, that we will envisage will grow the most or give the greatest contribution to growth, over half of total growth between those areas in particular. And encouragingly in Boston, manufacturing typically sets up the value chain compared to most metros. Mitigating some of the strengths of Boston will be things like costs and road congestion, and it's probably with that in mind that our forecast for Boston temper a little bit so that it falls back in line with other eastern metros and the US average. Minneapolis-St. Paul has the lowest unemployment rate of any metro covered, and that's largely due to its broad sector of place, insulating it from the downturn in a specific sector. You can see the strength it has in the metro. It's the only Midwest metro that actually outperforms the US average, and you can see that there are a number of sectors that play a role here. Moreover, a stronger economy means that migrants are attracted to the metro, and that's positive impacts for retail, which is the third highest contributor in our chart. Interestingly, the metro is blessed with a large mining sector, though before we identify this as a source of worry, it's not so much shale oil, it's things like gold, copper, nickel, and iron ore. And as well as that, the construction forecasts are quite strong. That's because a few major construction projects are underway, so the likes of going back to American football, the Minnesota Vikings Stadium. Improvements in the labour market and increased population should help drive residential and commercial construction respectively. With San Jose's strengths are very well documented, high property costs and labour costs as well as road congestion may start to impact on San Jose. And where that's the case, the Valley's losses are likely to be Portland's gains. Portland here has a progressive and easygoing reputation, especially when placed in the context of San Jose's alleged corporate worldview. Intel remains a hugely important employer, but increasingly other small, dynamic and innovative businesses are seeing Portland as a good trade-off between living standards and cost of living and hiring. Other specialisms include manufacturing of footwear and sportswear, legacy status, and a reputation for niche beer brewing. And the common theme here, obviously, is manufacturing. We believe that the sector will contribute about 55% of total growth over the forecast period. So Portland might be number 2 for now, but we actually have it catching up compared to history, and they may hope to trailblaze their way to the number 1 spot fairly soon. Phoenix is one of the biggest improvers in our GDP growth rankings, up 13 places to 3rd. Relatively well-balanced economy once again, which is the strength. Business services and real estate do lead the way, but finance, which was the largest contributor over history, we still see the outlook being fairly positive. A number of companies have located their contact and processing centres in Phoenix and neighbouring locations. Moreover, the area is becoming increasingly a technology hub. Phoenix is actually starting to be dubbed now as Silicon Desert. Some high-tech players like Intel saw promise in the metro some time ago, but again, new innovative companies are starting to see the field also. With that strength and softer livability factors, it does give the reputation for the city to be one where elderly people retire to, and that could lead to a perceived weakness of having relatively fewer people of working age. Though its current demographics data doesn't point to that, it's fairly replicant of the US, and it shouldn't be a major economic influence. However, leading on from this, and again going back to the industry outlook on the chart here, the construction should turn the tide with major projects like the Phoenix VA Medical Center designed to cater for an increase in health services from an aging population. And finally, Houston, somewhat of a special case across the 30 US metros we've covered, given its average higher reliance on the extraction sector and the effect of that of oil price falls. It's for this reason that we have it fallen from number 3 over history to number 16 over the forecast, losing 1.6 percentage points in that time. It should be noted that our forecast, this flash normally or typically occurs in this year, so 2015. Towards the end of the forecast period, as it returns to long-term fundamentals, we see the growth rates in 2018 and 2019 returning to somewhat norm and above the US level. That's partially because while oil is important to Houston, it's less so than in previous crises, with the reduction, for example, in the reliance on interstate banks, a positive sign. As well as that, diversification has taken place in the metro. so that the potential losses in extraction are partially offset by gains in like consumer spending sectors. So that means effectively one sector's loss, i.e. extraction, can be other sectors' gains. And again, the graph actually shows that even during the boom times for oil, 2010 to 2014, the mining sector at the bottom actually provided less of a contribution to growth than wholesale and retail, manufacturing, and business services. So it's worth actually just moving on slightly, touching on the outlook for office-based sectors, as that gives an indication of pending demand there might be for real estate in the future. We also switch our attention briefly to employment as a metric rather than GDP. So just to clarify, office-based jobs are ones in sectors like information, finance, real estate, and business services. And we present the information here as an index line chart of office-based versus total non-farm payrolls in the US. A few interesting findings here. Unsurprisingly, the downturns in the early 90s, but particularly in 2009 and 2010, saw office-based employment fall considerably more than the total. And that's intuitive given the impact on the crashes in the likes of finance and real estate, but also in professional services when we factor in like cuts in public sector procurement. Office-based employment recovered its pre-recession peak by 2013, so about a year quicker than the total. And furthermore, we forecast that it will have a stronger outlook than the total, which is good news for commercial property market and consistent with our strong outlook for construction and real estate as a whole. And if we look at where the magnitude of the office-based job creation is likely to emanate, no surprises that New York leads the way. Detroit's again shown up in a bad light. It's the only one where office-based job creation is not positive, and that can be traced back again to the crash of its anchor industry, the automotive manufacturing. That causes ripple effects in other sectors, with economic multipliers dictating the office-based sectors also face huge repercussions. It might come as a little bit of a surprise to some to see Houston number 5, given our downgraded forecast. However, this chart must be placed in context. It's the actual magnitude of jobs and not growth rates, so it is affected by the scale of the metro. And again, it's worth pointing the fact that Houston has diversified, so office-based sectors like finance, information, and business have gained momentum of late and should continue to do so. So just to wrap up the US, let's keep out a few of the key points at an industry and metro level. The recovery in world trade, despite some downside risks, should help support the manufacturing sector, which should boost Portland and San Francisco. Professional business services, finance, and information will rebound from the stronger growth in business investment and just generally stronger economic conditions, especially in the US, and that should benefit the likes of San Jose, Boston, and New York. Strength in consumer spending should help retail, leisure, and hospitality, a key indicator as to why Las Vegas has improved so much in our forecast. Construction should respond to stronger investment in consumer spending, helping the southern metros of Miami, Orlando, and Tampa, while government austerity may restrict federal, state, and local government spending, which may impact on Washington, D.C. So that sort of concludes our focus in the US for now. I'll now move on to Canada. I'll provide a little bit of a quicker snapshot of it, given time restrictions, but the structure will be about the same. So for Canada, it could be suggested that the macroeconomic picture isn't quite as bright. The diagram presents some of the key opportunities and weaknesses or constraints behind our Canadian macro forecast. I'll not go into any of them in great detail, but it's obvious from the forecast outlook that oil is of paramount importance for the Canadian economy, particularly for some metros within, as I'll go into in a moment. The dampened oil price forecast will undermine investment in the oil sector, while the falls in terms of trade will dampen income flows. It's obvious it could mean that jobs cuts not just in extraction, but also in the many industries in the supply chain. However, the slump in oil prices can provide some offsets, such as a more competitive exchange rate for Canada's non-fuel exporters and greater purchasing power for consumers. So with all that said, we forecast that GDP growth, which was 2.4% in 2015, could slow slightly to 2.4% in 2015 and temper slightly further still in the long term to about 2.3%. So slightly lower than the rates experienced in the US. If we look at the industry charts for Canada, there are a couple of key messages presented in this slide. Firstly, finance and real estate provide the greatest contribution to GDP growth from 2010 to 14, and again over the forecast. We see no reason why that should change. So that's partially related to the stability of the banking system in Canada, but it's also heavily predicated by the huge residential boom that the country has recently enjoyed. By comparison, agriculture and mining contributed the second greatest amount, 17% of total growth from 2010 to 2014. It experiences the biggest revision over the forecast period, as evidenced by the big fall in the blue bar at the bottom compared to the gold one. Basically, we think that its contribution can halve, so that it provides only about 8% of GDP growth over the forecast period. If we look briefly at two very different Canadian metros, Calgary, obviously very reliant on the extraction sector, compared to Toronto, where the spike in GDP composition is in finance and real estate. And intuitively, the effects of these compositions are very evident when we look at our GDP growth rate forecasts and history for the 6 Canadian metros. So the average annual growth rates for the oil metros, which are Calgary and Edmonton, fall by 1 and 2.4 percentage points compared to their history. So for the first time in many years, effectively, these 2 Canadian metros look like the rest of Canada. By comparison, Toronto remains relatively stable as the rapid growth of finance and real estate continues to support the city, whereas Ottawa remains the poorest performing metro in Canada, a consequence of its high reliance on its public sector being the seat of federal government. Finally, it's important to note that compared to the 2010 to 14 period, growth in Canada in 2015 to 2019, we believe will be slightly more muted, something which was entirely the opposite for the US, where actually the metros gained strength compared to their national average. And indeed, if we look at the Canadian metros here in bold compared to the US ones, which I've put in blue in every case in this table, over the short to the medium term, we can see that the exposure to oil does mean that Canadian metros do lag behind their US counterparts. For example, Portland and Seattle, which are relatively closely located to Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary, can boast stronger GDP growth than them in the future. In fact, Vancouver on the left-hand side of the table, which reflects the top performers, is the only one that makes it into the top performers. You compare that to Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and particularly Ottawa, which rank well below the United States average. So that all concludes the formal part of today's presentation. I'm going to pass you back over to George so he can open up the floor to some questions. If, however, you do want to reach out afterwards, because we don't get to your question, my email address is there on the slide should you want to get in touch.
Fantastic, Aidan. Thank you very much. Very interesting insight into what we can expect for the US and Canadian cities in the future. We've had a question in from someone asking about, again, the effect of oil prices. I know we touched on it briefly with regard to Houston and other cities. I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit more about what the impact may be for prices, oil prices either increasing or decreasing. And the question is what will price fluctuations do for the outlook of these methods?
Yeah, well, I suppose I have to admit I did expect a question along these lines, so I'm somewhat prepared. Oil prices have continued to decline in the early part of this year. They've moderated a little bit recently, so they're now about half of their June 2014 peak. It's important to state up front that our macro view is that we don't anticipate any significant supply response, either from Saudi Arabia or US shale producers, to come through until later this year. So those low prices, we believe, will persist for some time. That's a positive for world growth, however, as the money saved from the oil field and leading economies is now freed up to be spent on other goods and services. So in that context, we actually believe that most developed cities will benefit from lower oil prices. These economies are going to be ones that are heavily dominated by service sector activity, whether that be professional services, IT, or recreation and culture. Few are going to have an extraction sector that contributes more than a little bit to economic output and employment, at least directly. So the majority of cities that will share the benefits that lower prices will bring for demand for their services. US consumer sentiment has reacted fairly positively, especially in the early part of this year, and may envisage very strong consumer spending for the US cities in 2015. I suppose the diversity of the vast majority of the US cities that I've presented insulates them to a large part from the effect on oil prices. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to the rule, Houston, for example, and probably more pertinently in Canada, Calgary and Edmonton. This depend isn't just on the extraction sector where it will be filled, it will also be filled with supporting industries in the supply chain. Dallas, another good example, it's the second most oil-reliant US metro, for which we can get pretty decent data to see the effect of oil prices. The Dallas Fed's February manufacturing index did fall in February. However, despite the rapid decline in new orders that are being reported, actually employment outcomes from the BLS are showing increases both in mining and the total. We also have timely employment data for Canada. And again, the employment outcomes have not shown that there's been any real effect from the oil price flip. So on balance, we expect cities with a large extracting sector to continue to grow in 2015, albeit more moderate. We think that growth will probably be slower than the national average. And you can see that in our Houston forecast. We forecast it falling from number 3 in the growth rankings in 2016. So effectively summing up, the oil price falls are positive in many cities because they effectively provide a tax cut for both consumers. At the start of the presentation, I highlighted how we envisage to be about a $1,400 saving per household in 2015, and also businesses, especially those that are reliant on high utility bills and transport. And effectively, that money can be spent elsewhere. So there's going to be knock-on effects for some metros that are reliant on extraction in their supply chain industries, but for the most part, most will actually offset this.
Very good, thank you. We've got another question in about which cities have sort of changed the most, which cities are currently changing the most?
Yeah, so I suppose San Jose and Portland remains at the top of the growth rankings. In terms of relative performance, we envisage that over the forecast, the southern metros are going to be those that largely outperform, and that relates to the fact that whereas previously construction and housing was fairly dampened, we envisage that we'll have a stronger forecast, so the likes of Tampa, Orlando, and Miami should improve. I suppose in terms of transformation, obviously there are certain metros that are synonymous with particular types of activity or niches or specialism sectors. So San Jose, very heavily associated with Silicon Valley, and I noticed that Phoenix is trying to transform and has now been dubbed Silicon Desert. Interestingly, Cleveland's one that we have at the bottom of the rankings, I think second from bottom over the forecast. It's been one metro that has attempted to rebrand itself lately and shed its perceived weaknesses, so things like a reliance on traditional manufacturing, depopulation, and a subsequent skills flight. But compared to other metros that get it slightly further in the east, it actually also has a poorer quality of life relative to those metros. However, the official data that we've seen so far for Cleveland hasn't really shown that there's been much of an effect of that transformation coming through in the data. That's either a problem with the data, or it might be with the geography. So the metro area also includes Area and Mentor, and that may be seeing things. So as such, Cleveland's a metro that will really be keeping an ear to the ground for. We'll be looking at the data over time to basically see if that transformation is giving any dividends in terms of the actual GDP outcomes.
Yeah, very good. Probably got time for one more question. Could you get back one slide to the list? Yeah, exactly. Good question about Vancouver. Obviously, it's quite easy to notice that that's the only Canadian city in top performers. Could you elaborate a little bit on why this might be?
Yeah, I suppose again it goes back to the sectoral composition story. The worst performing Canadian metros, the other 5 all performing below the United States, is because Ottawa, for example, seat of federal government, austere times for government and education and health, not as good. Similarly, Edmonton and Calgary, oil extraction and supply chain industries downgrading the forecast. If you compare that to Vancouver, it stinks. It's probably going, whereas tourism spending has probably been downgraded over recent times, we see a pickup in that sector. Vancouver is obviously heavily reliant on tourism. So in the same way as Las Vegas has growing up the rankings. We envisage Vancouver will do so too. Again, probably related to the other growth sectors like business services and some of the exportable service sectors. And it's really probably that sees Vancouver outperform compared to the rest of the Canadian metros.
Very good. Very interesting. Thank you. Well, Adrian, I think that wraps up the webinar. Adrian, thank you very much for your insights. We will, of course, be sending the slides around to everyone who's dialed in. But thank you for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.